We'll talk today about something that I think should be of interest to INCOSE. It actually has to do with activity that we're performing together with the ASME, our sister society, colleague engineers, and an older and larger engineering society. And it has to do with the verification and validation of computational models and efforts that have been going on for a few years now, primarily through the ASME and some other groups as well, and how we think they should be of interest to INCOSE and also how INCOSE is trying to contribute to it. We'll also, since this is an activity that's ongoing, we're not talking about a finished result. We'll have a chance to talk about what's happening, and as part of that, maybe a little bit some of the different viewpoints that system engineers and material specialists and data scientists and others bring to this, different, not just terminologies, but also perspectives. And look forward to your questions as well. The picture, which hopefully you can see on what's I believe slide number 8, and as these are renumbered. This slide is to illustrate maybe in a nutshell what we'll be talking about, and particularly get out in front of an issue that we're using some terms that are familiar, but perhaps in a slightly different way. In that in INCOSE we frequently talk about verification and validation, and those conversations are reflected on the right side of the slide, where we're trying to use the perspective of the system engineer, perhaps refer to our favorite INCOSE System Engineering Handbook or the ISO standard 15288 about system life cycles and their management, where in that point of view we would use terms like system validation and verification to represent the idea of a couple of questions. One is on the right side, I have some draft requirements in my hand. Do they really describe what the stakeholders need? Am I working on the right problem, in other words, as people sometimes say, versus I have a candidate design in mind or perhaps already executed, and do I think that it's satisfied the requirements stated for it? And so we use verification for the latter and validation for the former, and this is old stuff to systems engineers, I think. However, those same terms are being used to describe something a bit different. It's related but different, and that's on the left side of the slide, how we think about models of systems, or models of anything, and refer to the validation and verification of a model. And lest you think it's really kind of just the same thing, it turns out to not be quite the same, even though there's some related use of terms. And so in this space, for some years now, the people that practice in this space, and I think some of on the phone here today in the meeting, would refer to validation of a model as asking, does it adequately represent what it's supposed to be describing? Is it a valid representation maybe of Newton's laws or the material's behavior or otherwise? And then we talk about model verification, asking whether an implementation of that model, maybe in a particular simulation tool, has been verified as indeed describing what the conceptual model claimed to represent, or it's got problems of maybe numerical stability or discretization or something like that. So this slide is maybe in a way a representation of 4 holes that we can fall into in the 4 corners that all of us in our careers probably have fallen into at various times and discovered these are important things to make sure are going okay. But the point of the slide is to say they're not the same, the left and right side, in that to make it more confusing, the model on the left these days is sometimes used to describe the system on the right, and they don't just collapse together. It turns out, as you reflect on this, you can realize that you might have a model representing a design of some kind from the left and be using it to help you simulate that design on the right and verify that it's going to work as you hoped, and discover that indeed it verifies the design just fine, only to find out that the model itself on the left was defective, or the opposite, if you like, to have a well-verified model on the left side that proves that your design can't work that's on the right side, which is a good thing from a system engineer's point of view. And as you think about the different combinations here, there's at least, well, you can put the different combinations together and think about it. So this is trying to reflect some of the perspective of this talk and why we have several jobs to do. Now, those of us in INCOSE realize there's a lot of enthusiasm these days in recent years for what we would maybe in the INCOSE crowd call model-based system engineering, and I think some of the folks in the meeting here are among those enthusiasts, and that would include myself also. There's lots of signs of engineering with models of other kinds is also growing in enthusiasm. Some of it goes back many, many years as a historical tradition of math, physics, engineering models. Of course, it goes back quite a long time in some of the disciplines. And INCOSE itself has come to recognize these things more in things like the INCOSE vision and the growth of things like over the last 10 years or so, the NBSC workshop, and the number of people involved in that, or in modeling classes. Our INCOSE board of directors of the Parent Society making it a strategic objective of at a board level to accelerate the transformation of system engineering to a model-based discipline. Our INCOSE working groups, we have joint activities with the professional society concerned with trade group concerned with simulation. So there's lots of different signs that at least a lot of people are vibrating about the idea of using models. In some cases have been for a long, long time. In other cases more recently. So someone might ask in the middle of all this enthusiasm, but what for? And so as part of trying to support INCOSE's strategy, we've tried to drill down a little farther and provide some instrumentation that would allow people that feel that for one reason or another they should be in their enterprises using more models to think about, well, why would you do that other than just to show off that you're doing more modeling, which unfortunately sometimes happens. And so what we've tried to suggest is that let's use what we already know. We seem to like a framework like the ISO 15288 framework, and this slide is simply representing graphically, kind of laid out in the V diagram, if you like, for some of the processes, what the 30-some processes out of lifecycle management processes out of ISO 15288 would look like, and to say, well, if we think these are things that have to happen somewhere in the life cycle of a system, do you suppose we might use models for some of them? And some cases, the idea is obviously yes, we already do, or we might, or in other cases not so clear. But it turns out to be a pretty fruitful question, actually, to ask questions like, well, suppose you're in charge of doing acquisition. Do you think models might be helpful in that? Not obvious at first until you think about it. Or if you're involved in the transition to manufacturing, for example. Other areas may be more obvious. And so this is one way to think about, in a more structured way, where are we maybe in our enterprise in the use of models, and where might we gain some more traction. And it's a way that we're trying to look at it in INCOSE. So if we expect that increased use of models will support things like critical decision making, the important thing in this talk is that we're really, and we should realize it, we're placing more trust in our models if we do that. If we're making critical decisions about finance or other business aspects or things that might be safety critical in their impact or societal impacts, or otherwise trying to extend our abilities to do effective system lifecycle work using models, then we must be trusting those models, and we should ask ourselves whether we should or not. So this talk is really about efforts to characterize the structure of trust or confidence in models and manage it. And some of you mentioned in your introductions involvement in VVUQ, as it's called, validation, verification, uncertainty, quantification of the models themselves is what that sort of question is about. Now, when we worry about this for different models, it's one of the questions that comes up pretty quickly often is, well, what kind of models are we talking about that we might apply this to? And, of course, there's all sorts of models, and actually it turns out to apply to quite a lot of them, although maybe not every one. So this slide is a semi-serious, not entirely serious representation of a bunch of different models that might have degrees of trust and verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification applied to them. And we're going to talk about a few of them of particular interest, particularly how some of the cultures of them are different in different groups that intersect within INCOSE and some of our other engineering disciplines. So as you see on the slide here, you can see everything from scale models, physical models, to sentence diagrams and neural networks and physics-based mechanical models and data models and models out of systems biology and computational fluid dynamics and otherwise. Lots of different kinds of models. I'm sure you can think of some others. For purposes of this talk, the ones we're going to be specifically concerned about are models of a general sort that are explicit data structures that describe effectively, we'll have to figure out what effectively means, a modeled thing. And that always means it describes it to a third thing, which here we'll call a model interpreter. So in this little picture, we're looking at a model on the left of some sort that's trying to describe apparently a riding lawnmower on the right, the modeled thing. And it's trying to describe it to a model interpreter that maybe initially might be humans, us, where we're trying to communicate with each other or analyze in our own head using a model some characteristics of that thing. But in other cases, the model interpreters are machines, maybe a simulation engine of some kind. And as the diagram illustrates, sometimes there are hybrids of these where there are different model interpreters working together to try to accomplish some task in the system life cycle that we discussed earlier. And this interpreter thing turns out to be kind of important. If we get overly fixated on just the model itself, sometimes we lose track of the fact that it was trying to serve an interpreter of that model to accomplish some purpose, and we want to think about that a bit in this talk as well. Now, within the different kinds of models to talk about, we won't discuss lots of different ones, but there's a few that are kind of important to think about here because they really maybe divide us a little bit. And so one kind we talk about a lot in INCOSE are system models or model-based system engineering models. And sometimes people consider those to be of a different nature or different level or somehow just inherently different than some other models. And sometimes people refer to other models, they'll call them physics-based models, for example, it's a common term, and data-driven models. And these terms are used to specifically differentiate some of these. And so we're going to try to cover a couple of those, where in every case it turns out that trust is quite an important idea. Executable or computational models are an important subset and one of the most important sets in the activity going on in the ASME, but that also reminds us that some of our models are not necessarily executable in the sense of an automated machine simulating them. They're interpretable in any case by someone, at least a human, and so there's still a question of trust, but they may not be executable. Some of these also refer to how the models are developed in the first place versus what the model looks like. So this slide's probably a little bit small for you to be able to read, but I'm going to try to explain to you what the nature of it is, and you can recover the slide itself in the deck from the chapter record of these slides. This slide is meant to point out and differentiate a key distinction being made in the crowd of folks working in this area between what are called physics-based models and data-driven models. And so the left side, sort of the red side, is about physics-based models, and the right side is about data-driven models. And the picture at the bottom is a little simplistic picture of a milling machine, a manufacturing process. And I should say that some of the work that's going on in ASME, in the working group that I'm in, is especially concerned with models of advanced manufacturing systems. So we like examples from that area. But part of my interest in this is to apply these principles across lots of kinds of systems, not just manufacturing systems. So in this example, there's a real system being modeled at the bottom of the page. it's a milling process of some sort. And at the top of the page on the left and right are a couple of different kinds of models of it. The red one on the left is called a physics-based model. People call it that at least these days. And why is that? Well, first of all, it describes and predicts the behavior of a system as seen from outside the system. And so the little diagram towards the bottom of the page there, where the little spheres and interactions between them are shown, it's trying to get across the idea that for some of these models, there's external views and internal views. And the external view has to do with the interactions of a system with actors outside it. And so some of these models are primarily concerned with that exterior behavior, maybe how our chemicals react, for example. And others are concerned more with, well, why do they react that way? And they're explanatory, not just predictive. And they say, well, it's because of the way chemical bonds work. And here's our theory of atomic behaviors. So physics-based models are, maybe in the history of models we've used as humans, the more recent things. They show up in the last, at least the ones that seem to work effectively in the last 300 years or so. And they not only predict external behavior, but they also provide an explanatory part because they decompose a system and they say, you know, here's our theory about the internal parts of this thing, whether they're atoms or gears or drivetrains or whatever they might be, and how those things interact with each other, and how those interactions then cause emergent behaviors by the larger system with what's outside of that system. And so those physics-based models, whether they're in chemistry or thermodynamic models or electrical science or otherwise, are trying to say something about how internal decomposed behaviors roll up into larger behaviors and predict, even if it's stochastically in some statistical way, how that larger system behaves. And so that's the stuff of the physical sciences, our partners in engineering, and those models can get pretty complicated, can have high dimensionality. On the right is an alternate representation of some similar things by a different kind of model called a data-driven model. That term has risen to be in wider use in recent years, and it refers to the idea that it's not trying to provide explanations of the internal physics of this thing or whatever the internal interactions are, but its formation as a model is driven by looking at a lot of data about the exterior behavior of this thing and trying to reduce its dimension using regression or other, the latest tools would be various data mining and expert systems and AI technologies, or take your pick, but in any case, try to find a compressed form that describes in a predictive way the external behavior of the system, but with some internal variables that aren't necessarily representative of any particular internal physics of the system, and they're not necessarily meant to explain something about the internals of the system. They just help reduce its dimensionality. And so a different crowd of people seems to produce these. They're the data scientists and the folks that are equipped with some of the latest neural network or statistical or other engines to produce this stuff, and they would not claim to be necessarily physical scientists, and yet would produce very helpful models, sometimes of much lower dimension than the one on the left. And if we're mainly trying to predict behavior in some envelope where we've have a reason to have confidence in this thing, then it's helpful for that. Now, if you're as old as I and a few of us on the phone here, you recognize that this is really just recapitulating the history of science here again, because all this has happened many times before over the centuries. As we looked up in the sky and discerned that there were patterns, after a while we realized there were patterns that repeated themselves over and over. Even if we didn't have a fancy computer to discover that, you could call that a data-driven model because we observed the data long enough that after a while we recognized a pattern and wrote it down. And we use it to predict what time the sun will come up the next day. And then on the left side, thanks to maybe Isaac Newton eventually came along and helped us decompose things in a way that was also explanatory and said, why does it happen that way, by showing some internal behaviors as well. So these terms may be a little bit newer and some of the tools involved, but the ideas involved go back a ways. And both of them are of great interest as practical tools for engineers, in which we'd ask, are these trustable models, and how do we go about trusting them? So in INCOSE, we have this tradition of using the terms verification and validation to refer to systems of interest. And now we're interested in managing trust in models, and we find the same terms being used there, but pointed to a different target. And so that's part of what attracted me into this effort, to try to help sort this out among our different colleagues. The picture I showed you as a startup here comes up again at this point to kind of remind us again of the idea that on the left we're going to think about the model and can we believe in it, whatever kind of model it is, and on the right we're going to think about a system that we're trying to characterize and can we believe that characterization. We talked a little bit about the scientific history of this already, so I'll maybe not repeat that. However, I think a point to make that's timely right now, and that maybe is a little more unique in the history of all these ideas, and is more recent, is this notion that the system engineering community often seems to tout pretty strongly. That's shown on the left. We call it the traditional view here, that says that we have various physical phenomena of electrical science and chemicals, chemistry, physics, and the like, and they lead to, on the lower left-hand side there, the traditional engineering disciplines of electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, and otherwise. And as those folks make progress in their disciplines, the systems engineers then come along to lay a cap over the whole thing, sort of the system engineering stuff that ties together all these things and makes sure our missile doesn't blow up or goes where it should. And that view is kind of, I think, the way we often think about systems engineering and systems views and things like that, as glued over the top of the underlying way of looking at disciplines. The view, however, that we're promoting here in this activity is a little different than that, and it has to do with how we think about these models and how we would go about characterizing them and trusting them, and that is that you can turn these things around a bit and think of the system phenomena as below all these things, because we're using it to characterize our models, and rising out of that is not only system engineering, but as we specialize it further, the individual disciplines, including not only disciplines of low-level technologies like electrical and the like, but also higher-level emergent systems of a larger scale, like vehicles and ships, or markets or ecologies, that also have engineering and science that goes with them as they emerge as well. This turns out to be very useful as you get around to thinking about how would you go about characterizing trust in models. So, just like in the history of other models, we've had to strengthen a little bit the idea about how we go about describing systems. And so there's some history of this you could look up if you wish to, that has to do with both describing things like requirements in terms of a little bit more, let's say, mathematical idea or a scientific idea like a transfer function, where you can think of the pros as still being there but representing a more general idea of transfer functions, as well as phenomena in general. And the point I'm trying to get to here to you is the idea that whereas the ASME efforts are especially concerned with numerical, let's say, material science-oriented characterization of models and the VVUQ of those special cases, what we've expanded that a bit to look at is trust in models in general, or at least what we would call system models, because a lot of the very good work that's been done in ASME about this, specific to numerical relationships, actually applies quite well once you invert that stack of ideas on the earlier slide, and you find you can apply it to system models in general, and that's why I think we can learn in INCOSE from the ASME effort. So I should say a little bit about what's going on there. There's an active set of teams in the ASME, some of whom have been at it for a few years, and they're writing guidelines and standards, and they're referenced in the material here later, on the verification and validation of what they like to call computational models, which roughly speaking, is what in INCOSE we would call simulations, where computations are done. There aren't just representations of systems. And they're inspired by things like the proliferation of computational models in finite element, the world of computational fluid dynamics, stress strain models, thermal and otherwise, electromagnetics and other types. I think it's, to be objective, it's important to say the people in that world wouldn't agree that the system models we create in recent years in INCOSE are quite the same as those. And that's where this kind of gets interesting to me, is how we can make them more the same and not think of our system models as somehow divorced from that world of real models of real physical systems. ASME has enough history of this to not only produce some good standards and publications, but they're many years into an annual symposium on the validation and verification of computational models that occurs every May, so we're just about to have it again in just a few weeks. And these are some of the things that drew me into it, as the idea that we could use the ASME framework as a foundation to apply to system-level models as well. Some of you may have been to the IW in January in Los Angeles, and we invited Joe Hightower from Boeing to come to that and give a talk on this, because he's one of the group leaders in our ASME effort on what's going on there. So I should say there's also a bit of an effort going on between ASME and INCOSE to work a little bit more closely together on this as well. I definitely have to say this is primarily an ASME effort at this point. I think I'm about the only INCOSE member on it at the moment, but of course there's a large number of us in INCOSE that are involved in models of some kind, and so it's a natural place for us to do more together. In ASME, there are about 6 different working groups, and as you may know, the difference between INCOSE and ASME is ASME actually writes standards. That's not something, we produce various products, guidelines, and things like that in INCOSE, but we're not quite into the, balloted generation of standards. In ASME, they do, some of which also become ANSI or other standards. In INCOSE, we find our way into those activities in other ways. We have liaisons into the ISO and other standards groups. But you can see here the different working groups, some of whom have already produced standards on computational solid dynamics and heat transfer, medical devices. As we get farther down here, we come to some more recent ones that are still in the writing process. And I joined the VV50 effort, which is working especially on computational modeling for advanced manufacturing. But I would say to you, and I often say to that group, that about 98% of everything I see that we're doing is not specific to manufacturing. A small number of parts might be, but mostly the examples are manufacturing. And so you may find reason to even consider joining this effort. We're also trying to make some use of something that's familiar to Rick and some of you that we've used in the INCOSE Agile System Engineering Lifecycle Model Discovery Project that has to do with a way of thinking about how models emerge and evolve and how we come to trust them, what the kind of the big picture system view of that is, by thinking about 3 kinds of systems in this picture. The one on the right, called the target system, or system 1, would be what we might call typically in INCOSE the system of interest, or the subject system. And it might be some manufactured product, for example, that we're choosing to design. And then that's system 1. And then the systems in the middle are called system 2, and they represent, among other things, all the life cycle management processes of ISO 15288, system engineering and otherwise, as well as all the manufacturing processes and service and delivery and otherwise, that have to do with managing the life cycle of system 1. And so all the work that we do in our day jobs, probably as being engineers at least, is in that space, system 2 space, and sometimes uses models. And then system 3 is, which looks kind of similar to system 2 in the picture here, looks similar because it's about managing the life cycle of system 2. And while that might seem very abstract, actually it's what we're doing today in this this meeting you're having. It's what INCOSE spends its time doing, and ASME spends its time doing, is trying to improve the practice of system 2, discover new things about it and make it better. So all three of these are of interest to us, but in particular, some of the learning processes that go on are of interest. And so what we're really concerned here with the idea is that we're creating models here. These models might be written down models that are computational models, or they might be models in our heads, represented both of them symbolically here, of System 1, and we want to know if we can trust those models. And this is not a new thing. This is something we've been doing for a long time. If you think about it that way, we observe the Systems 1s of the world, and we contemplate them, and we make models of them, and then we find out later whether they were right or not. We make them better and better, and that's what validation and verification are about. Likewise, we're interested in models of System 2 of how would you do that. So when we make models of System 2, that's a System 3 activity, and that's what we do when we make things like the V diagram or other representations of how do we do our work. And if we're big model enthusiasts, of course, we tend to make models of those as well in some form. So this is a framework we use a little bit to try to keep straight in conversations, because it can quickly get confusing if you don't have some way to reference what's going on. On this slide, you can study probably more when you have a copy of the slides to look at, but it represents a piece out of the model we're using of System 2 that's got to do with the validation and verification, coming to trust of models, whereas on the right side, we see our friendly milling machine over here that's busily milling away on some casting, and we're interested in the characteristics of maybe residual stress in the finished part after we get done doing our high-speed milling over here. And we've created some model of that, maybe a conceptual model of some sort, maybe it's based on physics, maybe it's a data-driven model. So there's a couple of possible kinds of underlying conceptual models, but those are then going to be used in an automated system, a computational modeling system of some kind that maybe has been purchased from your friendly automated tool vendor, maybe something that's homemade, or maybe some combination of those things. Includes model authoring software and the like, as well as data sets that go with it. And we're interested in the verification and validation, not just of the underlying conceptual model, but also the executable model, which goes along with the hardware and software, maybe the high-performance computing system that's part of that. And this shows the setting of the various players that are the conceptual modelers and automation coders and the like, ultimately to serve some purpose. This is a really key thing about this whole setting, is what in the world do we intend to use this model for, because our ability to trust it has a lot to do with what's its intended purpose. And so this is a little bit of a reference model we're using right now to think about different boundaries in this System 2, and in those different boundaries, what are our requirements, because we're really coming up with, in the ASME effort right now, requirements on a model. If we claim we're going to verify and validate the model, then we must know what the requirements were of that model. And it turns out that's a little harder than it might have seemed. So we're using some of the earlier tools I described today to accomplish that right now in our current work. There are two key relationships in this diagram, that asks the key questions about validation and verification of the model. The model validation relationship says, does the underlying model, it's a three-way relationship, adequately represent the system of interest, the milling machine over here and the aluminum casting that it's machining? Does it represent it adequately for the intended purpose of the model, which is the third leg on this, the user of the model? And so that third leg becomes really, really important, about what were you intending to do with this model. The second question it then asks is, when we implement that model in a computational engine of some kind, does it, and it has computational characteristics, it has hardware speeds, it has word lengths and discretization errors and stability issues, do all those things together adequately implement for the intended use that model? So that raises a bunch of questions about intended use as well, and that's the verification relationship. So these are the frameworks we're using to describe some of these things. Now, another interesting thing to think about here is this is actually a representation of the learning aspects of System 2. So for those of us that are interested in making our Systems 2 of our enterprises or our society more adaptable or agile we know that learning from experience in the most effective way and making use of that learning is a really important question. And so this helps us realize that, oh, in this framework, really learning is represented in these models, even if we've learned the wrong thing. It's a way to think about the learning process and the improvement of what we've learned as a foundation for validation and verification that follow. And this works very well for understanding both physics-based science, hard sciences type models as well as data-driven models. The requirements for a model include the model system stakeholder requirements. In other words, thinking about who are the stakeholders in the use of this model, which is different than the stakeholders of the milling machine, and what are their requirements of the model? What do they care about? And what are the technical requirements on that model? It takes a little practice to get used to thinking about the requirements on the model, which are not the same as the requirements on the milling machine. It can be more confusing yet if the model itself includes modeled requirements for the milling machine, but that's just the way the world is. So this is probably too small for you to read, but you can look at it later when you look at the slides. It is legible if you make yourself a copy of the slides. And what you can see here is we've compressed onto 2 pages, 2 slides, the stakeholder features of models. This is a draft in process, so you're welcome to make comments on it and help us improve it. This is our early draft in our committee work in ASME of what do we think the stakeholder features of a model are. And so there's lots of interesting things in here, and they're not all about numerical accuracy, even though that's, of course, quite prominent in it. It includes some other feature groups like what's the intended use of this thing and how well does it serve for it? Or what's the value of this model? Maybe it's extremely accurate and very trustworthy and has a wonderful user interface, but it tells us things that we already knew when we walked in the door and doesn't really add any value. Or the other side is that maybe it's the greatest thing since sliced bread and allows us to own a market. So the value of the model is not inherently inside it, and is an extremely important thing to understand when you're going to do something like fund the development of a model. Among some of the other things that are in here about trust are things like, is this trusted by regulators or other third parties or the market or by our customers? And those turn out to be quite important because we're looking at a subset right now in INCOSE of our markets that are the regulated markets in medicine and aerospace, where we have the FDA and FAA present, and they'd kind of like to have us not keep coming at them with completely unique things. So the question is, can we bring them pattern-based representations of models in which we've come to agreement, say, with the FAA or with the NTSB for automobiles, that this framework is, in fact, a validated way to represent crash tests, and we can actually jointly use it to predict things, or that, no, I've never seen this before, and you're going to have to convince me. Quite an important subset of this problem is in the regulated areas. There's also a much longer list of technical requirements on models, so we've just pulled out some samples here for you of some of the things that show up in the technical requirements on these models that are essentially a configurable framework of requirements on models that in a sort of a practical way would help people get their models together sooner, perhaps, or check the ones they have, but are intended ultimately to serve the purpose of verifying and validating the model. So that's part of the tool set that comes with this as well. We're using a meta model that we use often in INCOSE working group called the Patterns Working Group. It's called the S-star meta model. S-star stands for Systematica, and it's something we've used for a number of years there to help us have the smallest model we could find for the underlying description of systems, whether it's the issues of engineering and science in ISO 15288, whether we're talking about requirements or designs or failure modes or interfaces or otherwise. And that's helping us think about, as a group, what are these requirements for these models in general. And then a particular interest is what happens when we have patterns of those models and requirements. These are the regulated ones I mentioned to you a minute ago, where we want to come to agreement as industry segments or enterprises or societies that certain models are trustable. And I'm sure you can think of a number of models that are controversial in that respect right now in the public world about how do we go about coming to trust these things across groups of people and organizations so that we can apply them repeatedly and at less cost, so they're expensive to come to grips with. Now, within all of this is some things that several of you are, I think, specialists at from your introductions, and that's got to do with the numerical, quantitative part of uncertainty quantification, where there's a really large body of literature and lots of very good work already in hand on the mathematical subset of this problems. And some people would view that as the heart of this work, and we think it's a real important part of it. It's also largely available. There's a lot of good information available there, but the extension of it to systems models in general as to whether you can trust the overall thing this model tells you about what's the desirable behavior of an automobile, for example, is another matter. And yet these same principles apply quite well to that. And so the general nature of the approach, this is a work in process, and the bottom of this slide is trying to tell you a little bit about our strategy in it. It says the general notion about uncertainty and confidence tracing is asking questions like, do the model's external interactions qualitatively cover the modeled stakeholder features over the range of intended situations of interest? It turns out to be a hard question, and that's part of what we're trying to represent in the validation and verification of that aspects of the model. There are questions like, can you quantify confidence and uncertainty that the stakeholder feature attributes, which are really in the end where all the justification comes from, quantitatively represent the real system concerns of the real stakeholders with enough accuracy over the range of intended situations? Same idea applies to the area. The last one is more where most of the VVUQ that I've seen is applied, looking at technical performance attributes, and do they adequately cover the space intended and with the appropriate confidence? So the earlier questions on this slide are less treated by some of the literature, the later ones more treated by it. We think they all fit together, actually, and that's what part of this effort's about right now. I already told you about some of the activities in ASME and these working groups. You might care to consider joining them. That's what I did a year ago, or you might at least follow them. They have open meetings, and interested parties come and listen and make comments. INCOSE also has working groups that are active in this space, maybe not as far along as ASME is, in some cases has joint activities going on in our different working groups, and you might find those of interest as well. I probably left some out here, but as you know, there's some activity in INCOSE in these areas as well. So there's I guess a little bit of invitation to you, if you're not already actively involved, is there's things you could be doing. We think, first of all, that there's a lot to be learned from the standards already written over the last few years by ASME and the work going on there already. And I think our experience in the last year says that ASME also can learn a little bit from INCOSE about system-level models, even though that's not their main focus. And we've discovered other professional societies have a real interest in this as well. It's quite serious, so we think there's likely to be more multiple engineering societies working together. We're in a good position as kind of the ethical advocates on behalf of the profession to be maybe the more neutral party between regulators and enterprise groups concerning trust in models is a delicate thing. And so this is a chance for us to exercise our ethical roles as engineering societies. And you might ask, as Rick did with his questions at the beginning of these slides, is how is this related to your enterprise and your own interests? Do you need to trust models? What ones? Maybe they're not models you're creating. Maybe they're models from your suppliers. Or maybe you need to provide models to your customers that they need to trust, or other cases of that. I can tell you there's lots of work required here in this space, and so if your help is available, we'd certainly value it, or at least give us feedback. That would be helpful as well. And I've given you a couple of pages of references at the end of this in case you're interested.